Getting approval for Sergeant Gravis's medical treatment was easy, and the prefect seemed confident in the local Medicaid's ability to fully treat the Tyranid bioweapon that had infected him. Likewise, most of the stuff on Jim's part list was accepted without comment. The first hiccup was when we got to some of the really powerful psi-resistant materials. The prefect claimed they were in stock, but couldn't be released without authorization from the subsector capital, or the use of an inquisitorial seal. He claimed that due to the incident, it would be a long and difficult process to get authorization, but he saw no other option if we wanted to be discreet. Sarge pondered this for all of 3 seconds, decided discretion was overrated anyway, pulled out his interrogator's rosette, and plugged it into a proffered data slate. The prefect seemed quite happy that everything was going to be above board for once, saying that after the code was verified by the Telepathica's database, there'd be no trouble getting the materials or anything else on the list. Sarge cheered up at this, and was considering asking to add the fuel bill to the list when the prefect added, "except for the astropathic messages." With that, the discussion finally turned to the incident. According to the prefect, roughly half a day ago, some sort of psychic attack had hit the station. Every astropath who had been working in the choir chambers had suffered a severe case of exploding head. And those who hadn't been on duty had suffered everything from nosebleeds, to seizures, to complete mental breakdowns. It wasn't just limited to the astropaths of the Telepathica either. Several of the ships in system had lost their astropaths, and other varieties of sanctioned psyker had been affected too, albeit to a lesser degree. At a wave from the prefect, the Telepathica scribe, who'd been doing his best to avoid the attention of the big scary Inquisition people, spoke up. He said that some of the more lucid astropaths had started piecing together details about the psychic attack. It had originated in the outer system and had probably come from a ship heading to or from the station. The popular theory was that some terminally greedy rogue traitor was hauling a heretical artifact, or massively powerful psyker, or possibly even a bound demon into the Imperium to sell to a cult or something, and it had lashed out at the large concentration of psykers on station for some reason. It was at this point that Sarge had begun to feel really uneasy. Not because he suspected that there was a demon or heretical rogue traitor running around the system, but because he suspected there wasn't. With a rising sense of dread, our heroic leader asked the scribe if any of the surviving astropaths had been able to describe what the attack had felt like. When he heard the words, "a million barbed legs ripping across their minds," Sarge's composure cracked. He leaned back, covered his face with his hands, and quietly cursed to himself until the prefect asked what the problem was. In a fit of retardation, interrogator Greg Sargent answered him truthfully. The silence that filled the room when Sarge told the 2 stationers that it had been our cargo that had killed half the astropaths in the system was incredibly unpleasant. The weary apology that Jim added a few minutes later just made it worse. Eventually, the horrible silence was broken by the sound of the prefect's augmetics going ding and spitting out a long strip of paper. Sarge caught a glimpse of it and thought it looked like a sort of receipt or budget report, and the last number had a lot of digits. The prefect reviewed the paper for a few seconds, then tucked it away, hauled himself upright, and said he'd return after the search had been called off. As the prefect left, he then handed the data slate to Sarge and plugged his rosette into the transfixed scribe. He told the flunky to go run the code, then go fetch the choirmaster. Hopefully, the knowledge that the whole thing was going to be an official inquisitorial incident, instead of a cloak and dagger charade, would keep the man calm. When the two stationers had left the suite, the old diplomacy adept pulled out a small device which emitted a sort of low buzzing sound, and rounded on Sarge and Jim. The lecture Sarge and Jim got was scathing, and brought back painful childhood memories involving unfinished homework assignments and failed tests. It started with the importance of never admitting fault, and maintaining at least the appearance of competence, and then shifted into a general lecture on how to react to a diplomatic crisis. Sarge bore the lecture stoically, automatically standing at attention and adopting the blank expression employed by NCOs across the galaxy. His only movement during the whole thing was to put his comm-beat on mute when the rest of us figured out what was going on and started snickering. Jim just turned his ears off after the first minute. After what felt to Sarge like half a millennium, the old diplomat's lecture concluded with a bitter comment about how, on top of everything else, the scribe had run to the choirmaster on his way out to verify our identity. Sarge blinked as the diplomat detailed how the head astropath was too angry to even form coherent sentences, and had either punched a hole through a wall or severely broken his hand. After a thoughtful pause, Sarge asked the adept how exactly he knew this, and got a pithy reply about diplomacy being as much about listening as talking. It took Sarge and Jim a little while to figure out what was going on, mostly because Jim had to be brought back up to speed after he'd turned his hearing back on. But they worked it out eventually. The old diplomacy adept admitted that he'd placed bugs on both the scribe and the prefect. Also, he'd planted a few discrete data uplinks too. So assuming our cogitator adept hadn't been driven to complete distraction by Twitch, we probably had access to all unencrypted comm traffic on the station. It turned out that he was correct. When asked, the cogitator adept said he had the network cracked completely open. Additionally, he'd be able to get into the security cameras if someone could please convince Twitch to just sit down and watch the Skull's feeds instead of badgering him about changing their patrol routes every 10 seconds. Sarge, who was somewhat grumpy about not being informed of all the spy stuff beforehand, told Twitch to sit down and shut up, and demanded to be kept up to date on what the prefect and the choirmaster were doing. So, Sarge sat there, listening to reports, learning that the choirmaster had taken the scribe's data slate and had gone off to verify our inquisitorial credentials personally, and the prefect was still in the process of standing down the station's defenders with the aid of the recently arrived president of the Shipmasters Union. Meanwhile, Doc had finished looting everything of value from the storage bay that Gravis had been shuffled into, and had taken over the Space Marine's treatment while Sister Valerie went to have a word with the station's head Medicae about how long the wait had been. Doc made her promise not to start a fight, or refer to the wounded astropaths as warp-tainted mutants. Back on the occurrence border, Twitch had grumpily followed Sarge's orders and was watching as the cogitator adept began pulling in vid feeds from the station. Soon every screen in the room was filled, either by a feed from the station or one from the suicide skulls. For a brief moment, Twitch felt like he'd become a god. Between the vid feed from the station and the ones from his suicide skulls, he could see everything. Twitch could see the corridors around the dock, some of them filled with busy people, others sealed and empty. He could see crewmen hauling goods in and out from the docking bay, and the captain arguing over price with a harassed-looking stationer. He could see Fio working diligently in the psyker holding cells, and trying to ignore the way the zoanthrope's metal-plated face seemed to follow him despite the stasis field. He could even see Nubby, Tink, and Amy as they checked various seedy bars for their black market contact. For the first time in years, Twitch's paranoia faded away as it was replaced by an overwhelming feel of control. It lasted all of 15 seconds, and then something inside the jumble of warped and twisted mental gears that made up Twitch's mind went ping. Twitch reeled as his mind automatically began cataloging every single suspicious object, which is to say every man, woman, child, animal, servitor, and overlarge barrel on the station. He wound up sprinting from room to room, leaving the confused but relieved cogitator adept to monitor everything in peace, while he went to go put as many explosives as possible in between himself and the horrible mass of potential threats that was the station's population. A few minutes later, the rest of us were informed by the cogitator adept that Twitch had begun booby-trapping every locked door, air vent, and maintenance hatch in the docking bay. We decided that all in all, it was better to just let him do it, and warn the stationers to only use the main entrance. While Twitch, Doc, and Sarge did their respective things, the rest of us finally reached the last stop on our tour of just about every shitty bar in the station. Thankfully, despite how long it had taken to figure out which venue was the place with the curly thing on its sign, you know, the one across from the food place that serves the stuff with the sauce, the search had gone relatively smoothly. Smoothly, in this case, meaning that no one asked to inspect our boxes, Nubby was never caught with his hand in someone's pocket, Tink kept his mouth shut the whole time and didn't trip any alarms while poking around with his drone, nobody saw fumbles when we let him out to use the bathroom, or found out that what happened to said bathroom had anything to do with us, and Amy only lightly pummeled the bouncer who'd referred to her as sister, and later admitted that the man probably hadn't meant it as a comment about her hair. We found the guy who Nubby knew at the back of the bar, sitting on an extra-high stool. Amy, who was a markswoman after all, didn't even blink at the realization that our black market contact was a ratling. But Tink did a double take. As Nubby sidled up to the minuscule marketeer, Tink eyed the pair and asked, with his usual lack of tact, if there was some sort of height limit on being a thieving bastard. Thankfully, the half-dozen other ratlings in the bar were too focused on Nubby to notice the comment. Amy told Tink to stick with the pallet and try to keep his mouth shut, and watched as Nubby did his thing. Now, Nubby's heritage had been a matter of much speculation back in the Guard. Not in the sense of who his parents were, because even he admitted that figuring that out was a lost cause, but as to what horrible combination of human, abhuman, farm animal, and possibly Gretchen genetics had produced such a unique individual. Determining what to put the trooper's species down as had been a trial for several Munitorum clerks, and eventually the issue had to be sorted out by the commissar. He decided that for lack of any better fit, and because the Genarian 99th was not officially a mixed species unit, Nubby was human. He'd even issued the disgusting little trooper an official card saying so, just to avoid the discussion coming up again. The point is that Nubby, much to the relief of the entire race, was not a ratling. Despite, or perhaps because of this, Nubby had always gotten on very well with the little buggers. And this case was no exception. After a bit of amiable chatter, the marketeer and a few of his half-pint bodyguards led us off to a discreet warehouse to talk business. At the door, all of us, except for Nubby, who they were understandably reluctant to frisk, were subjected to a very thorough security check. Our anti-scan cloaks, knives, laser pistols, holdout weapons, and the homemade shock stick which Tink insisted on calling his power wrench were temporarily put aside, and we were each asked to supply a little bit of blood. They put the blood into some sort of scanner, which they claimed was checking to see if we were psychers, gene stealers, polymorphine users, or anything else which might compromise the deal. We passed, of course, and were allowed to keep our combeats, electronics, and even our weapons, since Nubby was a known factor. Also because the warehouse was monitored by a dozen remote-controlled laser turrets. Once inside the black market warehouse, which looked exactly like a normal one except for a large number of armed men in the front office, and the fact that every single crate was labeled excessively mundane things, we got down to business. At Nubby's signal, we started by opening a few of our crates of recreational materials and military surplus to convey that we were rather serious, and then handed over our shopping list. The change in the marketeer's demeanor as he reached the more esoteric items on our list was remarkable. He went from stereotypical jovial rattling to serious and slightly nervous businessman in seconds, and ordered his retinue and the warehouse's workers out. Once the room was clear, what had to be the most vicious bout of haggling in the history of the Imperium started. Despite possessing the charisma and odor of a weak-dead grox on a hot day, Nubby's deep familiarity with all aspects of criminality and his ability to wheedle, whine, importune, and blatantly lie had always served him well when it came to back-alley negotiations. The rattling wasn't a slouch when it came to haggling either, and responded with an equal amount of cunning viciousness. Amy and Tink were both taken aback by the ferocity of this argument, which seemed barely short of homicidal. But as it continued without either Nubby or the marketeer trying to kill each other, the two troopers adjusted to the situation and even tried to lend Nubby a hand in his negotiations when they thought they understood his plan. They failed abysmally, of course. Between their actually insulting insults, miscalculated threats, and lack of knowledge as to how the value of goods changed after they'd fallen off the back of a shuttle, Amy and Tink put such a dent in Nubby's progress that negotiations had to be temporarily paused. Once Tink and Amy had been relegated to helping the sole cargo servitor that had remained in the room fetching boxes, the haggling resumed. Crate after crate of narcotics, dubiously acquired valuables, and those well-made and untraceable small arms the Inquisition issued were exchanged for Xenos-made circuits, tools, and materials. At first, it seemed like our supply of illicit goods was going to run short before we had everything on Tink and Theo's list. But as the negotiations continued, the marketeer became more and more relaxed and generous with his exchanges. A careful observer might have noticed that the change in the Ratling's attitude seemed linked to how much time he spent within 20 meters of the cargo pallet, and how Nubby, Amy, and Tink tended to stay away from said pallet. This was, of course, what Nubby had wanted Fumbles for. They'd pulled this sort of con quite a few times, though usually not while Fumbles was encased in a shipping crate and hopped up on a downright unhealthy amount of stimulants. The Psyker wasn't directly messing with the marketer's mind, that'd be too obvious to any observers, as well as the marketeer himself, when he walked out of range. And honestly, we didn't trust Fumbles to do that sort of thing for any length of time without something exploding. Instead, the little psyker was just sitting there, concentrating on thinking calm and happy thoughts, and letting his aura do the rest. With Fumbles' help, we made it down to the last item on our shopping list with 2 crates, not counting Fumbles' and our other backup crate, still unopened. Unfortunately, that last item was a sticking point. Not even under the effects of the feel-good aura, and with a big box of only slightly warp-tainted servitor control units up for offer, the Ratling refused to even admit he knew what a Wraithbone was, much less part with a big old chunk of it. Nubby-eyed Tink, who implied via gesture that we really needed a piece of Wraithbone, despite the fact that he actually had no idea what Theo wanted it for. With a pained mutter about how he'd been intending to save it for his retirement, Nubby cracked open our last non-emergency crate. Amy swore, Tink let out a jealous sigh, and the Marketeer's jaw dropped halfway to the floor as Nubby drew out a master-crafted power sword larger than he was, and bearing a crossed scythe sigil on its crossguard. In the silence that followed, Nubby, teetering under the weight of the sword, asked the Ratling if he was sure he didn't have any Wrathbone in stock. Nearly a kilometer away, Sarge's NCO senses tingled, and he was seized by the feeling that something had just happened that he was going to be very angry about. He didn't have any time to dwell on this feeling, though, because right then the Cogitator Adept calmed in to say that a huge amount of traffic had just hit the station's net. He didn't mention what was actually being said, though, and when Sarge asked, the Cogitator Adept responded with a bunch of techno-jargon. So Sarge told Jim to handle it and turned to the Diplomacy Adept, who'd gone all fidgety. When Sarge asked what the problem was, the old diplomat revealed that the choirmaster had finally re-entered the range of his bugs, and was absolutely enraged with the prefect, as well as the scribe and the president of the Shipmasters Union. So far, all the yelling had been about talking to us without him being present and other unilateral decisions, but the Adept was sure there was some other cause, and promised to keep Sarge up to date. Back down in the warehouse, the miniature Marketeer had recovered from his shock and was inspecting the quality of the power sword. While Nubby chattered at him from just outside Fumble's radius, behind them, Amy and Tink dug out the small crate labeled Talc 10 kilograms the Ratling had directed them to, and complained at each other. Amy was in the middle of telling Tink, who was too busy whining about how much he'd wanted to disassemble that sword to even pretend to listen, that Sarge was going to blame her for this, when she noticed the Ratling freeze. After a quick kick to his shin, Tink noticed too, checked the screen of his drone controller, and gave Amy a thumbs up. As Amy and Tink came over to see what the problem was, Nubby finally realized that the Marketeer wasn't listening to his list of things he'd accept as change for Gravis's power sword and the control units, since they were obviously worth way more than a spooky chunk of rock. He sidled up to the frozen Marketeer and tapped him on the shoulder. The Ratling spun around, still gripping the sword, and Nubby jumped back with a little scream as the movement triggered a very painful memory. This in turn set off the Ratling, who held the sword out in front of him like a shield, and hastily began backing up and gibbering about the need to use the bathroom. We all watched as our black market contact ran out of the room and slammed the door behind him. Amy let out a pained sigh and asked Nubby if there was any chance the Ratling would be coming back, or could at least be convinced to return the power sword before trying to kill us. Nubby just cackled and began divvying out our big boy guns from one of the remaining boxes, while Fumbles burst from the other, began shouting about how we were all going to die, and immediately faceplanted as his still-asleep legs betrayed him. Amy caught her rifle and casually headshot the warehouse's cargo servitor, then sighed again and activated her comm bead.